Excellent!
Hey everybody, welcome back. This week I've been working on lots of different stuff. So for instance, I have the NAS build that I've put together over here. I finally got that sort of set up and the basics up and running. So I have a video for that coming on Saturday. I've also been working on getting the parts together for my wife's water-cooled system that I'm going to build in the Fractal Define Nano S. And I've also been doing this sort of ongoing organization and putting things where they should be project here in my work area. And I've come across a lot of CPUs that I've had. So I thought this might be something interesting for you guys to take a look at too, which is a lot of the CPUs that I've kind of collected over the years in working in technology and that kind of thing. So I'm going to go over what I have here in front of me. This isn't every CPU that I own because a lot of them are in use in systems that I have up and running here and there. And this is by no means an exhaustive look at, like, you know, the history of CPUs or anything like that. This is just what I still have on me. I try to collect these when I can, but I don't really do it. Like, I don't have like a CPU from every socket and platform that's ever existed or anything like that. That'd be nice to have. That'd be maybe in the future someday. Actually, let's start out with probably a problem that a lot of you guys have encountered, which is that I don't have all the CPUs I've ever used because I've resold them. A lot of you did what I probably did back in the day, which is I built a system, use it for a couple years, and then I would sell the system, you know, maybe scavenge a couple parts, but sell the system in order to buy parts to build a new system. So I do have a couple CPUs that I wish I still had around, including the first actual desktop computer that my dad bought back when I was just an early teenager, and that was using an Intel 46DX chip, which is an old school processor, and I don't even know what happened to that system when we finally got rid of it, but that was a family system. From there I moved to an AMD K6 450. That CPU ran at 450 megahertz. It was absolutely fantastic for me, and then again I sold that system when I was through with it, and I moved on to the Pentium 4. Now, my AMD K6 450 system was pretty epic, but it was based on a bare bones system that I had bought at Fry's, so I didn't really put the whole thing together a piece at a time myself. My third system that I could say was the first system I really got all the parts for individually and put together, I also don't have, because I did resell it, but I do have some pictures, so that one at least I can share with you guys and give you a better idea of like an old school system that I built back in the day. So here it is. Look, I've got an Enermax power supply. That's always a good decision. You might notice here that I have, for instance, like a copper CPU cooler on there. That's kind of cool. You also might notice that the cable management is pretty terrible. You know, it's using an 8-bit motherboard. 8-bit was my standby go-to motherboard company for quite some time. This is a TH7 RAID motherboard from them. These are the pictures I actually took before I sold the system. So you'll notice epic features like dual optical drives, DVD, as well as I think it's like a 24-speed CD burner, as well as a floppy disk. You'll notice my genuine Windows XP key right there, which you guys are all welcome to steal now. And then there's the system itself. I have no idea what kind of case that is. All I know is that front panel, like when you tapped on it, it would slide down, kind of like it was on hydraulics or something like that. And I thought that was pretty badass. So here are all of my CPUs arrayed sort of in chronological order. So AMD is on the bottom row, Intel is on the top row. These are actually from about 2002 to 2003 on the far left here, going all the way up to about present day for both manufacturers. Now, over here on the far left, you'll notice these CPUs don't have heat spreaders on them. That was a big advancement that was made, and you see Intel and AMD both doing that with heat spreaders on all their CPUs. I'll show you why they do that with this CPU right here. But AMD, for their part, went from these Athlon XP chips to their Athlon 64 chips. This was when they were doing really well, really putting the screws to Intel. This is when they started introducing some fancy new features like IMC, integrated memory controller, as well as actual dual-core processors as opposed to single-core, single-thread processors that had been available prior to then. From there, they kept moving forward with the Phenom series, followed it up with the Phenom II series, and then currently we have the top-end AMD CPUs, the AMD FX series. That's an 8350 right here, which was actually launched in 2012, but is still the fastest AMD CPU you can get. And if you're saying, Paul, you're wrong, they have that 9000 series as well. Well, you know the 9000 series is just an 8350 that's been so it can overclock more. So if you buy an 8350 and it can overclock to 5 gigahertz, it's a 9590. Hooray. As for Intel, we start up here on the top left with a Pentium 4, old school, super heat generating Pentium 4. After that, Intel started to kind of get their act together after AMD came out with their FX, or the Athlon 64 FX series. So Intel started to really push. This is when they introduced their tick-tock cycle after that. So these are LGA 775 CPUs. The QX6600 and the Intel Pentium Extreme Edition 955 are what I have here. And this is where Intel decided, you know what, those pins on the bottom of CPUs that can get bent and broken and damaged and stuff, we're going to move those onto the motherboard. So that is the first LGA land grid array CPUs from Intel. And these, I mean, the QX6600 is still a very, very highly respected chip, being a quad core and everything. The Extreme Edition was very high, had a very high clock speed. One of my CPUs that I do wish I still had was my i7-920. I did have one, ended up selling it. This was the first time Intel gave the Enthusiast platform its own socket and chipset. So this was LGA 1366 socket compatible CPU, and it used X58 chipset motherboards. They also introduced triple channel memory at this time, which is pretty sweet. Now, I am skipping a few generations in between this lineup of Intel CPUs over here because I don't have them all, but this is a 2500K. That is a Sandy Bridge CPU. This is actually the second generation Intel Core CPUs, but 2500K has a soft spot in all of our hearts because it had amazing performance, fantastic overclockability, and it was reasonably priced. It was like $215 or so, I think, when it launched. Beyond that, of course, you have these bigger CPUs on the top right, and that's Intel's Enthusiast line. So starting with the Extreme Edition, I think Intel kind of got the idea, hey, we should make a separate series for the people who are really into this kind of stuff. So they made the Enthusiast platform. What I do have here is this i7-3960X. This launched in 2011, and it went with socket 2011 and X79 chipset motherboards. Intel also stepped up to quad-channel memory support with this series, and this was also the first time that Intel came out with a consumer 6-core processor. Next, we have the newest Intel Enthusiast series, which is going to be using X99 chipset LGA 2011-3 motherboard sockets, or socket motherboards, and this is a 5820K. I also have a 5930K and a 5960X, which are all super awesome. This one I use for testing and stuff like that. But then lastly, we have the 6700K, which is the current fastest consumer level processor that Intel makes, although it is still a quad core, whereas you can get 6-core and 8-core CPUs if you go with their Enthusiast platform. Let's move back over here to the beginning though and take a closer look at some of these chips because I think they deserve a closer looking at. So let's start with this one. This is the Athlon XP again. The specific one we're looking at here is the 3200. AMD also at this time used some pretty confusing nomenclature to name their CPUs. So this has a 3200 Plus is the actual name of this CPU, Athlon XP 3200 Plus. Although the 3200 Plus was sort of AMD being tricky. They're trying to say that, you know what, the frequency doesn't matter because of some other things that they built in there, and up till then, well, even still now, frequency is often looked at as like what makes a CPU fast. This 3200 Plus, though, actually had a 2200 megahertz clock speed in real life, but AMD was basically saying that this lines up with processors from Intel that run at 3200 or 3.2 gigahertz. This one has a 400 megahertz bus speed. It launched in May of 2003. And it sold for just about $500. Yeah, that's right, $500 for an AMD processor. Anyway, though, it doesn't have a heat spreader, which is probably the main thing that you'll notice here, versus like these processors that have that metal piece on top. But this actually lets you look directly at the CPU die, which is just that square, that rectangle that's right there in the center. And this is what was exposed on CPUs for lots of time. You might notice it also has these 4 little pads on each corner, and that's so that when you were putting like a heatsink fan on top of it to keep the thing cool, it wouldn't damage the die. Nevertheless, that was still fairly easy to do. One other thing before I show you the other one is just to look at the pins on the bottom. Also very, very, I want to say the pins are large. They might look small, but these are some pretty thick pins on there, especially if you compare it to, say, newer ones on the Athlon 64. So you'll notice, they made the pins a little bit finer. That actually meant that these older CPUs, as far as the pins on the bottom, this is PGA, by the way, which is pin grid array, were actually a little bit harder to damage from the pin side as far as bending pins and that kind of thing. I'll show you some bent pins here in just a second as well. But why was this guy so delicate? And why is there a legacy now of whenever you install heatsink fan that you should install and mount one corner and like you know the cross pattern you're supposed to do when you're tightening down a heatsink fan? You're supposed to like just get one corner kind of on there and then do a cross pattern, one corner and only tighten it down a little bit at a time. That is because before people realized that this was a problem, they would do stuff like this. This is another Athlon XP processor. It's not too much different than the one I just showed you. This is a slightly lower model, 2800 plus though, Athlon XP. This one did launch a year earlier in 2002, and it sold for about $400 when it launched. But look at that. I left the thermal paste on here. Let me get you guys a nice close look though. So if you guys can see that corner right there, just where I'm kind of trying to point at with this razor, it's chipped. Just the corner has a little nick on it right there. That means this processor's dead. That's right. The actual die that you're looking at right there on top has about the resiliency of glass, which meant that if you did try to put a heat spreader down on this, and you did just go ahead and tighten down one corner of it all the way down before you bothered with any of the other corners, it was going to go down, put pressure at an angle, and you were going to end up breaking the corner of your CPU die, and then your CPU's dead. And then you'd return it to wherever you bought it from, and if I was the person at the place where you bought it from who took the CPU out and looked at it, I would then send you an email that says, "I'm sorry, sir, or ma'am, your CPU is physically damaged and cannot be replaced." And it was very sad. The flip side to that, though, would be... Flip side, that's kind of a joke. Let me show you, though. Anyway, this Pentium 4 right here, which is in shadow. But look, it's a Pentium 4. It's had lots of use. This isn't my Pentium 4, unfortunately. This is a different Pentium 4. I didn't use this one personally. Alright, so as you can maybe see on the corner here, we have a massive amount of bent pins on this, which meant whoever had this processor before mishandled it, or perhaps they tried to install it with pressure when they were using a ZIF or zero insertion force socket. But anyway, they managed to bend these pins down pretty horribly, I might add. There's several more scattered throughout this particular CPU. Bent pins. I did notice though that none of these are actually broken off. When I would get returns of this nature and I saw bent pins, I would actually often spend a bit of time, and I got pretty good at repairing them. I'm not going to show you guys exactly how I did it now, but basically you take a razor blade. I can't even see what I'm doing, but you know, whatever. You take a razor blade and I would kind of put it along one line and kind of, you know, bend one line to be straight, and then I'd go with the razor blade into the other direction and do along the line there and kind of bend them up to be straight. And it took a lot of kind of precision and patience and carefulness and that kind of thing. But as long as the pins weren't like bent flat down to the PCB, you can generally get them to sit up straight again. And once you've gotten those all straightened up and aligned and drop it back into a socket, generally the CPU would still work. So whereas with chipped dies on CPUs without a heat spreader, I was pretty much forced to give people bad news. Often when damaged CPUs of this nature would come through, I was able to fix them, and if I got it working again, then we were able to honor the RMA and give the person a, well, usually they wanted a refund with something like this. But I always felt like that was nice to be able to do, to be like, hey, you broke your shit, but I fixed it, so here's your refund. Moving up the line on our AMD processors, though, you'll notice this one here that has some actual writing on it. So I wrote down Athlon 64 3000 Plus on this, because that's what it is. However, if you see the actual text printed on the heat spreader there, ADA 4600 DAA5BV, that's not the same. That's not the same model as an Athlon 64 3000 Plus. The difference in price between a 3000 Plus and the 4600 at the time when this processor first hit my hot little hands was pretty significant. I think the 3000 Plus you could get for $200 or $250, whereas the 460 was over $800, or for the 4600. So this was a unique chip that came through, and basically what the entrepreneuring person who had this chip originally did was they popped off the heat spreader. So delidding a CPU is what that's often called, but they were able to use whatever methods were at their disposal to pop off the heat spreader from a much more expensive CPU, a 4600. Then they took a cheaper CPU, this 3000 Plus, and remounted the heat spreader to it, and then returned it and tried to get a refund. We caught them, I'm happy to say. We tested it, and we're like, that's not the right CPU, dude. Very, very sneaky, though, and I don't know if this is something that still happens or not. I'm kind of out of that realm anymore, but for what it's worth, this is still a working 3000 plus AMD processor. It just has the wrong heat spreader on it. Look, all the pins are nice too. Now, I also wanted to at least give you guys a quick look at this one because it's one of these godlike. It's a godlike, I'll call it that. Godlike. This is an Athlon 64 FX. This is the FX62. FX60 and FX62 where I think we're kind of at the peak of AMD's like dominance when in the mid 2000s in the CPU industry. These were more than $1,000. They were dual core at a time when dual core was a very, very new thing, and they were also overclockable, which is pretty badass. Let's move up to the Intel side though, so I can show you guys this QX6600 Core 2 Quad LGA 775. You might notice I have these labeled. I wrote engineering sample on this because it is an engineering sample. Before I go into what an engineering sample is, let's look at the bottom. You'll notice this is an LGA CPU. So since I showed you this horrible Pentium 4 with all of the bent pins, Intel eventually got sick of that, and they're like, you know what we could do? We could move all those pins over to the motherboard side, and then no one will ever be able to bend pins on a CPU ever again. And they haven't been able to do that. So LGA's land grid array, and that's again as opposed to your AMD processors, which are PGA or pin grid array. Okay, back to the engineering sample thing. You might notice here, if you can read that text, which I think you're able to, at the top there it says Intel Confidential. Intel Confidential. So an engineering sample is basically CPU that Intel has produced that is not meant for retail sale. So instead of stamping it with what you would see on a retail CPU, which, do I even have any? Do I have any of those, or all of my? Yeah, it would appear that pretty much. That's not entirely true. I do have non-engineering sample Intel processors, but none of the ones that are out here. Those are all engineering samples. Anyway, a non-engineering sample like this one will actually say what processor is on there, and will tell you, like, you know, the SKU and that kind of thing. Whereas engineering sample processors will not. They have a very mysterious bit of text on there which says Intel Confidential. It will, I think, tell you, it'll tell you where the fab is. So this one's from Malay, and it might give you a little bit of extra information. But often with engineering samples, it becomes difficult, especially if you have multiple ones of them, to tell which one is which. So that's why you'll notice on my engineering sample CPUs over here, I usually put either some non-stick tape up there, so with writing as for what they are, or you can just use, you know, a permanent marker and write directly on them. Or you can do what I did with my 3960X and do a little bit of text that's actually right up there on the PCB on the edge, and that also works as well. So there you have it, guys. Hopefully this has been a nostalgic walk down memory lane for a few of you, and perhaps an eye-opening look at the way CPUs have developed, physically at least, over the past 10 or 15 years for others, probably most specifically those who are newer to the PC enthusiast DIY build your own computer space group. That's official, but PC Master Race, we'll just call it that. Anyway, thanks so much for watching this video. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button on your way out if you enjoyed it, of course. And down in the description, you can find important links to important things, such as my store, where you can buy shirts, mugs, and glasses, which is a great way to support me and get yourself a little bit of merchandise. You can also find my Amazon links down there, too, for UK and US, and click those before you shop at Amazon. That helps me a ton. That's all for this video. I will have this video on the NAS box coming up on Saturday. Have a fabulous rest of the week and weekend, all of you, and stay safe. Stay very, very safe.